we give very practical and tailored dietary and lifestyle advice, and we often will run tests, which might be a blood or urine test. And it's also good to mention that it's holistic in that if I'm seeing a child with ADHD, they might also have eczema, they might also have some digestive problems, and so I'm aiming to support all of those areas of health. I'm not just focusing on the ADHD, because often there's a link between all of those aspects of health. And this is some of the nutrition and lifestyle factors that we address in the clinic, and these are some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. So to start with, we know that children who are well nourished do better. There's lots of studies that show that, and when we talk about well nourished, we're talking about children who get all of the vitamins and minerals and essential fatty acids and all those key nutrients as part of their diet that's important for the health of the brain. So it's not about counting calories, it's not about energy in, energy out, it's about looking at all the different components of a healthy diet. And there's been quite a few different studies. There's just a few little examples here where this Canadian survey of 5,000 11-year-olds found that those who ate more fruits and vegetables were 41% more likely to pass a literacy assessment that was taking into account socioeconomic factors. This one was another study which looked at the diets and school performance of over 2,000 children, and found that the overall school performance was worse amongst those who were more likely to eat sweets and fried foods, and better in those who ate a better diet. Been some studies looking at the omega-3s and reading and behaviour, and this again is looking at children in mainstream schools, and found that those, when they measured the blood levels of the omega-3 fatty acid, they found that lower levels were associated with poorer performance. So even amongst the normal or neurotypical children, we find that better nutrition helps them to do better. And other nutrients which are important, so iron, and this is interesting, this study was it found that children who were deficient in iron in infancy and early childhood had mood and learning problems even many years later. So it's important to get nutrition right as early as possible. So the first sort of the factors I'm going to talk about is sugar. And I call sugar the brain poison because I want to be absolutely clear about how horrendous sugar is for the brain. It's implicated in a whole range of different sort of symptoms: aggressive behaviour, anxiety, hyperactivity, learning difficulties, and so on. And in an ideal world, none of us would eat any sugar ever. But I realise this is not an ideal world, and I'm not saying that we should never have any sugar ever, but we should just be very mindful of the amount of sugar that we eat and that our children eat. A few studies here, so this one looked at children with dyslexia, and obviously a lot of children with ADHD also will have dyslexia. They found that in a double-blind study that the children who ate a diet higher in sugar had more erratic eye movements. So they found a direct effect of sugar and the sort of eye movements involved in reading. In this study they looked at Norwegian teenagers and looked at the effect of drinking soft drinks, and found, of course, those who drank the most soft drinks had the worst performance, and in terms of mental distress, hyperactivity, and conduct problems. Now, this probably isn't a surprise to most people. One of the things that's interesting to recognise is what does sugar do? Why does it affect our behaviour so much? So this study was they gave 25 healthy children a drink which contained the same amount of glucose as you would find, or sugar, as you would find in a can of soft drink. And they measured their adrenaline levels, and their adrenaline levels increased 5 times the normal level for up to 5 hours after they drank the sugar effect. So, not surprisingly, the children had difficulty concentrating, they were irritable and anxious and so on, while those adrenaline levels were elevated. So the adrenaline, remember, is our fight or flight hormone. So it's the hormone that is released when we have an immediate stress. So you nearly have an accident to the car, or a child nearly runs in front of a bus, and you have that immediate sensation of adrenaline. It's very hard to concentrate when that's just happened. You'll know if you're mid-conversation, you think you won't even know where you were to go back to the conversation. That's the effect of sugar, because that's the effect that sugar's having on adrenaline. So, of course, it's not going to have a great effect on a child's ability to be able to concentrate and focus. In this study, they found that children had high levels of withdrawal, anxiousness, depression, delinquency and aggression who are consuming higher amounts of sugar. So there's a lot of studies which show a direct link. So sugar is the pure form of carbohydrate. So when we eat foods that are carbohydrates, even things like bread, pasta, potato, rice, contain carbohydrates, but those carbohydrates are broken down in the body when we eat them, and then they're released into sugar. So it's okay to eat carbohydrates because the body releases the sugar from those carbohydrates in a sort of a slower, controlled, sustained way. So we get sugar trickling into the bloodstream, which we can use up over time. Refined sugar, so sugar from refined foods, is like rocket fuel. So it's the pure form. It's, it's almost like you might as well inject it. It's the pure form of sugar. So it goes flooding into the bloodstream. So we get this massive sugar high. What happens after a high is we get a low. And so we get a high where we might feel a whole range of different symptoms. And then, of course, what comes after that is the low. And if anyone knows how you feel when you've got a blood sugar low, that feeling we think, do you know what? I'll be fine in a minute, but I really just need to eat. But if everyone just stop bugging me, please. I don't know if anyone's experienced that. So that's the blood sugar low. So obviously we as adults try and manage that, but children have a much more difficult time because they know that they're not feeling good, but they don't think, do you know what, I'll be fine, just let me eat. It's also hidden in a lot of healthy and low-fat foods. You might be interested to know there's a movie out called That Sugar Film. Has anyone come across that? Basically, the whole purpose of the film is to actually, an adult has gone on a diet where he has cut out all sugar, except he has specifically increased the consumption of the foods labelled healthy. And look it up, Google it, it's on Facebook, it's all over the place, it's called That Sugar Film. So fruit yogurts contain up to 6 teaspoons of sugar. Breakfast cereals, in general, are horrendous for sugar. Even the ones, we know that Crunchy Nut, I shouldn't probably say brand name, should I, specific product, but since we're being recorded, but sugary cereals, we know they're sugary, but then you look at the ones which are not supposed to be sugary, and actually they still have a pretty strong sugar effect. Things like plain porridge oats are much better because they're slower released. Most children do better if they have protein in their diet in the morning, so starting the day with eggs or something which is a bit, which is going to give them more sustained energy rather than a cereal. Fruit juices and smoothies, I can't recommend them at all because of the sugar effect that they have, unless you're making them at home yourself and you know what you've put in them, and you put some slow releasing carbohydrate fruit in there. Maybe you've added some nuts and seeds, maybe you've used some coconut milk because that's got a low sugar effect. So if you've made it at home and it hasn't been processed in a factory where the sugar that has come from the fruit has now been processed into a much faster releasing sugar. But I would not ever recommend buying a juice or smoothie unless you are in a shop where they make it right there in front of you, and then at least it's going to be nutritious. Things like white bread, white pasta and white rice also have quite a strong sugar effect because they've been refined, so the sugar is very quick to get into the bloodstream and to have that sugar high followed by the low. So what about fats? So fats are often the villain of the piece, isn't it? We know that fats are bad in our diet. But what's important to remember is that over 60% of the brain is actually made of fat. So fat is pretty important for the brain. And fats can be good as well as bad. So good fats, so most of them I'm sure have heard of omega-3s and fish oils and oily fish and how important they are for the brain. There's been quite a few studies which have shown improvements in children in terms of learning behaviour and development for omega-3s. Omega-6 is also good, although most children require it much less in their diet in terms of supplementation. Most children have, if they're eating a sort of a standard diet, don't really need to add omega-6. And then of course you've got olive oil, which is a very good fat. Often if you're looking at supplements, you might be looking at ones that say omega-3, 6, 9. I wouldn't bother with the 6 and 9 because it's really what you want is the 3. The 6 is probably already enough. And the 9, basically, it's an expensive way to take olive oil, so just use more olive oil. At the clinic, we do blood tests, so we will measure levels of these particular fatty acids in the blood, so we know specifically what each child needs, rather than making assumptions. But for most children, if you're going to make an assumption, omega-3 is a good one to go with. Avocado is a good source of fat. Coconut oil, good source of fat. Eggs and quality meat. People are often surprised about that. If eggs again provide fat, which is important for the brain, quality meat, ideally it's better to eat better quality meat less of it less often than it is to eat poorer quality meat more often. Because if an animal has been is a grass-fed organic, the fat profile, the types of fat in the meat is actually better for our brains than if you're eating really intensively reared animals. Butter and green vegetables are also good sources. So again, people are often surprised about butter. Really? Is that really something we should eat? Well, it certainly is. In fact, you might some of you might have seen this a year ago, where finally it made it to the cover of Time magazine. Eat butter. For decades, it has been the most vilified nutrient in the American, and I'd say British, worldwide diet. But new science reveals fat isn't what's hurting our health. And really, what's hurting our health, if we're comparing fat to sugar, is sugar by a mile. But of course, fats can also be bad. The worst kinds of fats are the trans fats, and where you'll find those are in a lot of supermarkets are trying to remove them, so they are certainly less prevalent than they used to be. But in the sorts of foods which are prepared baked goods are a bit of a minefield for trans fats. If you buy a muffin, there are muffins that you can buy that are not going to go off for a year, and they sell by date as 6 months to a year in the future. You think, okay, what did they do to that to make it last that long? What they did is they put trans fats in it. So if you're going to eat, this is the time when I'd say if you're going to eat sugar, eat a nice homemade piece of cake. But I would certainly avoid all the packaged stuff, because it's not only is it higher in sugar, but it's also going to have the worst kinds of fats. And of course, deep fried foods and trans fats, and barbecued charred meat is also not such a good source of fat.
Why is that?
Because the fat is damaged in the it's oxidised in the charring process.
And barbecue?
Yeah, so barbecue. I mean, I've put this is a barbecue here. It's not, and again, it's not like don't ever have a barbecue. But just if you were charring meat and barbecuing meat all the time, then I'd say that would be a problem. But just be aware that it's not good. And if you're going to have a barbecue, try and have the the meat that's sort of cooked nicely all the way through, rather than sort of charred on the outside and barely cooked in the middle. So better cooking of barbecues perhaps is going to be good. And I just wanted to put this study up as just an example of the omega-3s. So relates to depression specifically, but it's looking at children with depression aged 6 to 12. And so again, talking about the kind of the pros and cons of medication, antidepressant medication is not generally recommended for children. I thought this was quite a good study to show that there are quite significant mood benefits to omega-3 in children, and these are children with major depression. So when we're looking at types of depression, major depression is the type which is most significant and most disabling. And it just shows that even in children with major depression, the omega-3s have quite a significant impact. And actually, just what I wanted to say at the beginning, which but I skipped over, was people often think about nutrition as an alternative to medication. So just to answer that now, because I know it'll be a question, is I would say it's not necessarily an alternative to medication. I would say it's more complementary. And by that I mean you don't have to choose medication or nutrition. You can do both. So you could say, I'm going to try nutrition first, and then if need be, well, let's go to medication. Or you could say, I could try medication, I could do nutrition on top of it. It's not an either or. It's absolutely fine to do both together, because I think it's difficult if you've got that choice to make that you have to choose one over the other. All I would say is that if a child's on medication, it may be more difficult to monitor the effects of a nutrition program, because it might be more difficult to see how well it's working. But so if the need for medication wasn't urgent, or you were kind of not keen on the idea, I would say do the nutrition first, give that 3 to 6 months, and then the medication is always an option. But certainly it's not. It's certainly possible once for children who are already on medication to go on a nutrition program and get great results. So the next factor, eating a rainbow. So we've all heard the term eating a rainbow, and we've heard about superfoods. So what makes a superfood, apart from a headline in the newspaper? So in general, the reason we call them superfoods is because they have these substances in them that usually are the substances which give them colour. So berries have these flavonoids and anthocyanins and so on. And it's those substances which, if you're going to call a superfood, that's probably why they are. And these are substances called polyphenols, and that's the substance which give food its colour. So the plant produces them as a defence mechanism against attack. So when the plant is growing, it's being attacked by animals, it's dealing with changes in temperature, maybe it has got enough water, maybe it's got too much water, and it produces these substances internally inside the plant that are good for the plant but also really good for us, and they tend to be the things which give food its colour. So that's why eating a rainbow is so important. They aren't vitamins and minerals, so they don't have an RDA, they don't have a specific amount that we should eat every day, but they're increasingly shown to be beneficial for health, and that's why eating a wide variety of coloured food is important. And increasingly they're showing that polyphenols can have neurotransmitter-like effects on the brain. Research is in an early stage, and so it's not possible at the moment to say, you should definitely have berries every day, or you should definitely have turmeric every day. What we can say though is eating the rainbow, the wide variety of colours, is going to be beneficial. And if you want to know where they are, it's the colourful fruits, vegetables, etc., herbs, spices, seeds, nuts and so on.
Can I just ask how much fruit would you say is okay to have day, given that it's high in sugar?
Yeah, so in general, the focus should be more on the vegetables than the fruit, and in general that's usually where the challenge is more on the vegetables than the fruit. I think fruits, as long as it's fresh, and if it's not dried, not bananas, if all other fruit, I would say most children don't overdo it. So I don't tend to set a limit, but the vegetables should outweigh the fruit by a ratio of 2 to 1 would be a good sort of aim and way of managing that.
The second category down, brassicas, what are they?
Oh, things like cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, that kind of group of vegetables. Okay, so the next factor is vitamin D. So vitamin D, most of us, when we went to school, we would have learned how important vitamin D was for bones and teeth, but actually what we know now is vitamin D is absolutely vital for the brain. And deficiency is really common in the UK, and low levels of vitamin D are linked with developmental disorders. So probably out of everyone in this room, I would estimate that probably one person might have enough vitamin D, everyone else will be deficient, unless you're supplementing. So that's how common it is. And getting a blood test is quite straightforward, but most of us should probably be looking at supplementation. Where do we get our vitamin D from? So you can see if you expose your full body to the sunshine for 15 to 20 minutes at midday in summer, and you've got fair skin and you're not wearing any sunblock, you can make 10,000 IUs of vitamin D. If it's not, you're exposing your full body. If it's not midday, it's not summer, you haven't got fair skin and you are wearing sunblock, then your ability to make vitamin D is dramatically reduced. So most of us don't have the opportunity to be out there in the sun doing this. So vitamin D, we make it all through the summer so that we can use up our stores in the winter, but most of us are not making enough over the summer. Food sources, you can see the oily fish there. By comparison, it's quite a small amount. So to get it purely from food, you have to eat a lot of oily fish, which is pretty difficult for most people and most children. Mushrooms and eggs are a good source. They aren't really. You would have to imagine how many eggs you would need to eat, So cod liver oil used to be, so when our maybe parents or grandparents used to take cod liver oil back in the day, actually it had a lot of vitamin D then, but it doesn't, the modern ones don't tend to these days. Sometimes some fish oils will have a little bit in them, still not a lot, maybe 400 IUs in a sort of typical serving, which of course doesn't compare anything to about the 10,000 IUs that you could make on a nice sunny day. Obviously always important to not burn. I'm not suggesting everyone should be out there getting burnt, but it's really important to get some sunshine exposure, not be so paranoid about the sun, and get plenty of sun exposure without burning, or take a vitamin D supplement, or holiday abroad on a regular basis. It would also be nice. The next factor that I wanted to talk about is food sensitivities. So how many people here have kind of looked at things like gluten, casein, that sort of thing? Can I just, yeah, so a few people. Okay. So it's often a bit controversial because, you know, it's a big thing to make such a dramatic change to a child's diet. But symptoms of food sensitivities can be very wide-ranging and can include all of these symptoms that we can see here, so irritability, aggression, nervousness, depression, poor concentration, ear, nose and throat problems, very common. So those children who are constantly having ear infections or blocked nose, throat infections, chest infections, all of that sort of ear, nose and throat area, always often on antibiotics, those children are extremely likely to have food intolerance. And the digestive symptoms, again, often indicate a food intolerance, but many children can have neither of those sets of symptoms and still have a food intolerance, and can have a whole range of different types of symptoms. So,
excuse me, if we go to the previous slide, so what does it mean, symptoms of food? No, the next one. So if you strongly
attraction. Yes, so paradoxically, often we can really love the food that we're intolerant to. Not always, but so people who really cannot live without, you know, dairy products, for example, are more likely to be, because we think that the reason is that when you take the food, your body kind of responds to it in terms of to try and kind of give you some endorphins to get through it, and you get addicted to those endorphins. Or the other possible explanation is that when you look at the breakdown products of gluten and casein, so the proteins which are in wheat and dairy, the name of the protein, so the name of the protein in dairy is called casein, the name of the protein, the peptide, the smaller chunks of it that it breaks down to when you digest it, is called caseomorphine. So the morphine has an opioid-like activity. Likewise, gluten, gluteomorphine. So also you see some children, when you try and put them on a gluten and dairy-free diet, they do exhibit what we call drug-seeking behaviour. I would never recommend just stopping it in its tracks. I would say it's always good to reduce it slowly over time, rather than, because it can be unpleasant for everyone. So there are food intolerance tests, I would say, which are useful. They're, you know, the ones that we use are blood tests that can use a finger prick, a finger spot of blood. I wouldn't say they're 100% reliable, you know, maybe 80-90%, but they can be useful in terms of giving an indication. Another alternative is to do a trial period of exclusion. So for most children, if you can get them off gluten and dairy, and I'd say those would be the top two, for a month, you might see a difference, and then often the difference is really when you introduce those foods back in again. Now obviously it's quite not easy, but it's and it would take a lot more sort of discussion than we've got time for here today, in terms of how you do it and how you manage it and that sort of thing. But it can be quite worthwhile in terms of actually seeing an effect. The other foods which are commonly problematic are soya, yeast, and unfortunately eggs are also often a problem, although I don't like to exclude those. But if we had to pick two, it's the gluten and the dairy. So gluten, wheat, rye and barley, and then all forms of dairy products. Okay, so some of you might have heard of A1 versus A2 milk, or A1 or A2 milk. Has anyone heard of? No? Okay. So there's a particular type of, so different cows produce different kinds of proteins. So our lovely, slightly mad-looking black and white Holstein Friesian cow produces the standard sort of A1 milk, and our much more attractive, pretty brown Jersey-style cow produces something which is called an A2 type of milk. And so for some people who have an intolerance to dairy products, they can have a problem with A1 milk, but they can be okay on A2 milk. So in some places, like in New Zealand, they've actually changed the entire national herd, and it's a huge dairy producer, from A1 producing cows to A2 producing cows, because they think there's huge health benefits to moving to A2. Now, the benefits are not proven, but for some children, if you're thinking, well, you know, do I have to cut out all the dairy products, or is it just some types? So some children they'll be fine on cheese, but they can't have milk, or they'll be fine on goat's yogurt, but they can't eat sheep's yogurt, or maybe they can eat, you know, there's a whole different. The thing to do is to find out whether they have an intolerance at all, first of all, and then to try different things and find out, oh, actually, they're okay with sheep's yogurt. They might not like it, but they're okay with it. But so then you know what you can and can't use. And then for some, in some supermarkets, like in Waitrose, for example, they do sell A2 milk. So again, that's another way of sort of saying, well, maybe the problem is the A1 versus A2 milk. So food additives and hyperactivity. So for a long time, I think a lot of parents have suspected that food additives cause hyperactivity in their children, and finally, a few years ago, there was a really good study which showed that even in children who do not actually have a hyperactivity disorder, food additives cause hyperactivity. Obviously, again, children vary in their sensitivity, so there are some children who are going to be more or less sensitive, but for any child with any sort of behavioural or developmental disorder, I would certainly try and remove food additives from the diet. You can often on the internet you can kind of find information on sort of the 10 worst or the dirty dozen, that sort of thing, and that can tell you the major ones to look out for. But in an ideal world, most of them would be better off out of the diet. Those were the ones that were tested. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is our gut, the world within. So did you know that in your gut you've got 10 times more bacteria in your gut than you've got cells in your entire body? So as a complete organism, we're about 90% bacteria and less human. So the gut is like an ecosystem. So it's like a little mini Amazon rainforest with possibly thousands of different species, all living happily together, all competing for food and competing for the environment. And your ecosystem is unique to you. So if they took a sample, a fecal sample now and a fecal sample from you in 10 years' time, they could match you in the same way that if you took a fingerprint now and a fingerprint in 10 years, you could be matched with your original fingerprint. Your gut flora is unique to you, and the genetics, the contribution of the genes of the gut flora to your overall genome, so we've all heard of the Human Genome Project, is much greater than our human genes. And it's influenced by things like genetics, so that affects it as well, but also our diet really affects the balance. So again, if you think about the Amazon rainforest, if you sort of shipped in a lot of food that was really good for tarantulas, you would end up with an Amazon rainforest which was just overrun with tarantulas. Tarantulas in themselves are not bad, but if you killed off all the animals which eat tarantulas, and if you provided an enormous amount of tarantula food, you would end up with an ecosystem overrun by tarantulas, and that would not be a good thing. And it's the same in your gut. If you provide food for certain species and you kill off some of or don't provide food for the species which keep them under control, you can have an imbalance between what you might consider to be sort of good and not so good species. So antibiotics can be a problem because they are going to be disrupting the balance of gut flora, and there's a whole lot of other factors. Stress can be a factor in terms of affecting our gut. And what's interesting is there's increasing evidence of the role of our gut flora in mental health. So they've done lots of very fascinating studies, which I could talk about for for a whole day probably, if you let me, in terms of how the gut flora affect our mental health. But I'm just going to give you one little example where they took different mice. So there were mice who were genetically more anxious mice and always perform badly in stress tests. And then there are genetically more relaxed mice. They always do really well in stress tests, always seem to be pretty chilled out. They took the gut flora from the different kinds of mice, this is the only thing they did, and swapped them over. The genetically anxious mice became relaxed. The genetically relaxed mice became anxious. And so it just shows that your behaviour can be directly affected by the type of bacteria in the gut. And that's one of many studies which I could talk about. So where does our gut flora come from? Well, it comes from the placenta when we're in the womb, ideally through the birth canal, so we get a face full of bacteria from the mother as we come through the birth canal. We get some from breast milk. In an ideal world, we're eating sort of old-fashioned fermented foods, which most of us don't have. I'll come on to a bit more in a moment. We get it from the outdoors, so hopefully babies get to roll around a bit in the dirt outside. and stick stuff in their mouths, which is an evolutionary adaptation to try and increase the range of bacteria. That's why babies want to stick stuff in their mouths. So, of course, in the modern world, we don't let them do that. Oh no, don't do that, it's dirty. And then we get the wet wipes out and the sterilising things, and we're just sterilising everything. Actually, what they're trying to do is increase the range of bacteria in the gut, which is a good thing for them. So let the babies roll out in the dirt. Don't let them, there's some stuff you don't want them to eat, but they should definitely be out there more. And then colonisation of the gut is reduced by caesarean birth because they don't go through the birth canal. If the mother's on antibiotics that will affect it, formula feeding, it's going to have an effect because it doesn't have the range of bacteria in it. The fact that we have a lot of refrigeration and chemical preservation, so we're not using fermented foods. Children are outdoors less, and of course we live in this overly sanitised environment with too many wipey things. And so then, as I said, so the establishment of the gut flora occurs up to about age 3 and then is fairly stable, and we have sort of what we call the poo print, which is similar to our fingerprint and to our iris pattern, and that's unique to us. So ideally what we want to do is look after our ecosystem, and again, most important for children. And in a nutshell, it's about having them eating fibrous foods, well-chewed vegetables and pulses. So the more of those, that's basically providing food for a beneficial, diverse range of bacteria. Sugary or processed food, it's kind of like providing the tarantula food. It's feeding the less beneficial bacteria. And more fermented foods, so things like sauerkraut and kimchi, miso, tempeh. These are the foods which have been made by bacteria and other organisms from the air. At that old-fashioned food, which are making a bit of a comeback, that the food manufacturers kind of, you can imagine they've sort of veered away from them over the last few decades because it's easier and safer to make foods which have been sterilised and they are, so there's no bacteria in them. But the problem is that that's not been so good for our health. And obviously sometimes antibiotics are necessary. I'm not saying don't ever use them, but there might be times when the doctor says, well, maybe let's, give it a couple of days and might resolve in itself. So if that's possible, then that's great. And following with probiotics, there's some good bacteria to follow to kind of replenish the bad bacteria. Move on to sleep. I know sleep is a tricky issue for a lot of kids. And even in neurotypical children, short sleep duration is associated with higher ADHD scores. So these are children who don't even have ADHD, they are worse. Now, it's not surprising, none of us feel great if we don't sleep. They found that the omega-3 DHA, which you would find in fish, oily fish or fish oil, children who had higher levels of omega-3 had better levels of sleep. And again, this was looking at mainstream children, so there would be similar effect in children with ADHD. So I have to say we get great results with sleep. I really can honestly say that. It's things like magnesium is a mineral, which is a really good relaxant, and an amino acid called taurine is again quite calming and relaxing. People often are suspicious of taurine because they've seen it on the label of energy drinks. It's not in there to give you energy. I think it's actually in there to take the edge off what the energy drinks are doing to you. So the taurine bit is the calming, relaxing bit. It has a similar effect in terms of your brain as things like alcohol or diazepam. Obviously not so extreme, but in terms of that kind of taking the edge off kind of feeling, and it's very, very safe. Stopping the stimulants, obviously that's not surprising that caffeinated or energy drinks, but also sugar. And again, some children are sensitive, more sensitive than others. So for some children, even small amounts of sugar or really small amounts of energy type drinks early in the day can affect their sleep later on. Sleep hygiene, bedtime routine. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this. The importance of the wind down and the not having electronics in the bedroom and the problems with screens and that sort of thing. So I won't go on about it, but it is really important as part of the picture. Other things, I've kind of grayed them out a little bit because it's probably better to get advice with them. But you can take an amino acid called 5-HTP, which converts in the body into serotonin and then into melatonin, which is a sleep hormone, and suits most children. But again, I'd probably with these two, I'd say, well, maybe take advice. Also, there are herbs, and again, maybe take advice of those. It's a bit more like taking medication, especially if a child is on medication. I'd be a bit more cautious about those. But magnesium and taurine are safe for all. So just a bit more about magnesium. So we call it nature's tranquilizer. Again, it's commonly deficient. So we do blood tests, we measure magnesium in red blood cell levels, and we find it is commonly deficient, and it's probably the supplement I recommend the most. Maybe besides vitamin D. So deficiency symptoms: sleep problems, anxiety, constipation, hyperactivity, and depression. The food sources are green leafy vegetables and seeds. So trying to get enough through the diet is difficult. And because modern farming methods, green leafy vegetables are less magnesium rich these days than they used to be. And we know how popular green leafy vegetables are with most children. So it is difficult to get enough through the diet alone. Water. It's obviously it's important and important for the brain, often overlooked, and of course it does make the best drink. I think I think in terms of culturally, we've kind of moved away offering water as a drink because we see it as boring, or that is. But I think we need to move back to that as sort of water should be the default standard drink, and anything else should be the occasional treat rather than the other way around. So in terms of what to do, so this is in a nutshell. Obviously, for each child, it's going to be a different requirements. But in a nutshell, if you looked at a diet which is Mediterranean style, you have plenty of vegetables, fruits, seeds, nuts, pulses, oils, fish and eggs, and ideally none trans fats, refined carbs and sugar. Obviously in the clinic we would work with each individual to kind of look at where they're at the moment, and then what the most important steps are to take sort of to move them on to the next to the ideal diet, because for some this is a big leap, for some it might not be such a big leap, but we would sort of break it down into smaller steps. Including fermented foods, which if you look on the health food shop, they're increasing their range all the time. Just make sure when you're buying them that you ask, is this a fermented food which is still alive? Because some of them on the shelf will have been fermented and then pasteurised. So in general it'll be the refrigerated ones, but just ask the health food shop, they should know. For most kids with ADHD, a fish oil, magnesium, maybe zinc, B vitamins, or you could kind of look at a multi, and a vitamin D is probably a good idea. If you're just buying over-the-counter sort of bog standard supplements, they're going to be safe for all children, but if you wanted to take it a bit further and use things which are a bit more higher potency, then obviously I'd recommend getting advice. Drinking water. So the don'ts is a short list really: sugar or refined carbohydrates, juices and smoothies. I think that the focus on what to cut out of the diet has got to be the sugar. And just something about influences on food choices. I think it's just quite interesting that in terms of, obviously children go through a phase of being quite restricted in terms of their food choices, and sometimes that can be a short-lived phase and sometimes it can be a long-lived phase. One of the reasons they think that children who are formula fed might have more difficulty adapting to a range of flavours is because formula only has one flavour. So they have the same flavour day in, day out. And then when they go on to being weaned, of course, suddenly there's this whole range of flavours. So babies who are on breast milk, where they're having all these different flavours coming through in the breast milk from the mother's diet, are going to be usually better at taking different food, especially if the mother's eating a broad diet herself. And they have this thing called neophobia, which is this built-in mechanism to prevent them from poisoning themselves. So when we were cave people and they got to sort of toddling age and they could kind of toddle off out of the cave and go and eat a poisonous berry, there was this inbuilt mechanism to prevent them from doing that. So they get to that point at toddling age where they suddenly don't like the look of anything new, which is to protect themselves, but also, of course, means that at that stage they tend to start thinking, oh no, new food. But it's important, they will take new food. It just can take, the researchers say that 10 to 15 repetitions of offering a food. So don't give up after the third or fourth time. Just keep offering, no emotion, just offer, and eventually. So using food for comfort or reward creates unhelpful associations. So I think it's very common, and probably most of us grew up with this, if you eat your vegetables, you can have your pudding. If you do this, you can have sweet. If you do, using food as a reward is something that we probably all have done. We've all had it done to us, and we're all doing it to our children. It's not a good idea, because the food then becomes, the treat food then becomes of a much higher value, and it does create unhelpful associations. So try as much as possible to just never use food as a reward, and not use it as a comfort, because many of us are oh, you're falling over, oh, have a biscuit. It's not a good thing to start, because then we become comfort eaters, as many of us maybe have experienced. So we want to try to move away from using food as a reward and use anything else, stars and stickers and charts and whatever, competitions, whatever it might be, but try not to use food. And most of us know from ourselves, as soon as you say to somebody, oh, here, try this, it's the healthy option, do we want to eat it? No, because we think, oh, it's going to be boring and tasteless, and I'd much rather have the much more exciting option. So try to avoid eat it because it's healthy. It's like, no, find other reasons why it might be good to eat. In terms of and it's going to vary from family to family, but many families have a treat cupboard or a treat tin, and I think if you're trying to get your child to eat less of what we might call the treats, of the biscuits and crisps and things, it's very difficult. If they know there's a whole cupboard full of them or the tin full of them, it's very difficult to say, well, yes, they're there, but you can't have them. Whereas if you can just say, well, there isn't any, then the whining and the pestering stops a lot sooner. So it's in everybody's best interest to not have that in the house. And what you do in the home, so the 80-20 rule, if in the home most of the food is pretty good, then when we're out and it's at grandma's or it's a special occasion, then it's okay to deviate and have the treat food. But then the child gets to learn, oh, okay, at home we eat like this. And again, it's that sort of makes it easier for you as a parent, because you're not having to deal with this constant pestering for things which they shouldn't be having. And then, of course, what that leads on to is the whole family hopefully taking this on as well, because it's much easier for a child to eat well if the whole family is eating well, and certainly at least eating well whenever the child's around. And what you do in your own time, obviously, I leave it to you. And things like stickers and stars, any kind of strategy that you might use to get your child to do anything that you want them to do, use those same strategies. If they're successful with other factors, then try them with food. That will get them to eat more food, and whether that might be eating a new food or eating a certain amount of a food and having daily rewards that build up to weekly reward, or whatever that might be. Your children best, and what they'll respond to best.